Stuck inside my mind in this quarantine pause. The light at the end of the tunnel isn't in sight. Where do I go to find someone to talk to about all of my flaws? You can never validate me, tell me the light. I searched until nothing I'm anxious and depressed and my coping skills are not fine. We weren't a fit and it felt like a waste of time. I heard an interview and I felt an instant connection. I learned CCH, DVD and mindfulness skills and each and every session. I'm pulling through, ready to ask the next question. The next question. The next question. The next question. The next question.
Hello, and welcome to NextQuest podcast, where I ask your potential therapist questions so you don't have to. I am your host, Noah S. Garcia, licensed professional counselor supervisor. Today, I welcome to the show Julia Aziz, licensed clinical social worker supervisor, ordained interfaith minister, certified clinical hypnotherapist, and has also done studies in traditional healing, who will be discussing her practice in an area of specialty, grief and loss. Welcome to the show, Julia.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you've got quite the bit of credentials. Can you tell us more about your credentials and experience?
Sure. Well, I started a long time ago. I came to Austin in '97 for my master's in social work. And actually, after I completed that, maybe a couple of years later, did a seminary program in interfaith studies. And through the years, I've been a therapist for over 20 years now, and that's really changed over time. I'd say that therapy was my first career. I started, at 22, but I think now I see it as I'm in my second career of therapy now, because it's really changed as I've grown and changed, and as I've learned more about the process of healing and growth. So I've been a meditator for many years. I work with movement and body awareness, parts work, that sort of thing. So, really I'd say more than there's all these acronyms after the name, but what does that really mean? The way I see it is that the therapist is as good as what she or he has integrated into themselves. So I'd say at this point I work pretty intuitively, and I'm grateful for that training and education and experience, and I feel like it's given me a good foundation to be able to show up with people and listen deeply and see what's needed in the moment.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Do you accept insurance? If so, which ones? If not, why not?
I don't take insurance. I purposely keep my individual counseling practice pretty small. I don't have more than 12 sessions in a week, and I put a half an hour in between each one of them so that I can really cleanse myself and really feel focused and ready for each person. So insurance billing takes, as I'm sure takes a good amount of time and effort and energy. And I do some contract work with the Flatwater Foundation that serves people with cancer and their loved ones. So that's sort of the work I do to make my individual work more accessible, but I do just private pay other than that.
Okay. Do you have a sliding scale?
I'd say that the answer to that is the same. I don't generally have a sliding scale. There have been, situations where somebody's needed it. But generally I do that work for Flatwater and end of life counseling and people with cancer. Mostly I do full fee. And, the other reason why I don't take insurance is more of, I don't work from a medical model, and I don't, I can diagnose people, but that's not the way that I see people. Mm-hmm. So at this point in my career, I feel pretty grounded and sort of working on my own 2 feet.
Got it. Do you have weekend or evening appointments?
I don't. Every once in a while, if somebody, there's some kind of schedule change, someone might come in on an evening, but generally my appointments are during the day on the weekdays.
Okay, cool. What drew you to being a therapist?
So actually, can I add on one thing? I do one
Sure.
evening a week, I lead a group, and that is also, where I can work with people at a lower cost and bring people together. And I really believe strongly in the power of group work. So it's not a therapy group. It's what I call self-healing in community. And I can talk more about that later. But anyway, that's on Tuesday evenings. Sorry to interrupt. Let's go back. What was the question that you had this time?
What drew you to being a therapist?
What drew me to being a therapist? I was a very empathic and sensitive child. I felt things deeply. I felt the pain and suffering, not only my own, but of the people around me. And I didn't understand why people weren't talking about that, why there seemed to be something unacknowledged, and I didn't have the words for it. And I was, how they, talk about fair weather friends. I was kind of the stormy weather friend. I was the friend that we might hang out sometimes, but you might come to me when something was really troubling you. So even as a young girl, I felt the heaviness of that. I felt the weight of not just my own, but other people's as well, struggles. And I remember clearly being in the backseat of the car, and my mom, I was probably in middle school, and my mom was maybe talking about jobs that people could have. And she talked about a therapist, and it was the first thing I ever heard of that I thought, oh, like that may actually be a way that I could help people. Like that may be a way I could actually do something of use. So pretty early on, that was introduced to me maybe around middle school. And then in high school, I think there were a few psychology classes, electives offered, and I just kind of dove right into it. But that said, the role of a therapist has never fit me completely. It's always felt a little restrictive. So this is why I say I feel like I'm in my second, even though I've been a therapist sort of all along, I feel like I'm in my second career of it, because I had to do some unlearning of the psychology that I did learn, unlearning of the, like the medical model, the perspective of people and growth, and really move from this idea when I was young where I thought maybe I can help, maybe I can fix something, or maybe I can help people feel better, like it was about how do I make people feel better, and what do I do? I learn how to do that. And that has really, that had to be dropped early on, very early on. Once I started even an internship, working with people and realizing, whoa, this is way beyond what can I do here, and going through my own process also, as a person in a healing profession, like the letting go of the ego around that, that you can actually do something like that for another person, and really appreciate that my job isn't to fix anything for anyone, but that the suffering that we go through is life. It's the fuel for our growth. So we're not meant to not have it, but what can we learn from it? And so can I sit with you through those difficult times? Can I sit with you as you face the shadow and the courage it takes to do that, and be a space where you can find your own answers, and get to be a witness to somebody's own learning and growth. And, it's humbling, and it's also freeing in many ways. And so I'd say in this second career of being a therapist, I feel more grounded in being, being on the journey together in this way. And that my job is to be connected deeply myself, and to see your light, to see the strength in you, even if you're having trouble seeing that, and then to trust what happens next, to trust the process and be in that. And that's very different, I think, than when I first came into it. And I was, especially as an empath, kind of like, it all feels like so much, like, how can we tune that down? And, that was a different place to be coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, I think our approach should, grow and change with us as we grow and change over time. And a lot of what you were talking about right now sounds similar to like meaning making.
Mm-hmm. Tell me more about that.
Well, in that, in suffering, suffering is only suffering if we feel that way about it.
Right. It's like that Buddhist metaphor of like when you're trying to ride a wild horse on top of a wild horse,
Right.
making your life a lot more difficult, instead of, okay, what's my learning for today? Like, here's where the edge is, here's where I'm being stretched, so can I breathe into that stretching? Can I work with it? What is life trying to teach me right now?
Mm-hmm. And, what meaning does this have for me in the context of my own life and my own beliefs and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I would say that my, for lack of a better word, spiritual connection or spirituality is more the foundation of my therapy practice now.
Mm-hmm.
Because I see, I feel a lot more spaciousness around, like I don't have this idea that, like, if you're struggling with something, that I have an idea of what you need to do now, or like what would make it better. Like, I feel more trust that we are given, that we each have our own curriculum here, and that our job is to show up, to it and respond as it comes. And it's a real honor to get to be a part of that process with somebody, as a therapist. That's what I love about the work. I mean, it's really an honor to that trust, and that presence.
Yeah, for sure. Well, tell us a little bit about yourself, hobbies, interests, TV shows you're watching, music, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I love to dance. I do miss that about the pandemic, because I miss getting to dance, and love to listen to music from all different cultures. I'm a long distance walker. I walk every morning for as much time as I possibly have. I've been known to walk 10 miles to pick up my car at the mechanic, just for the sake of getting a walk in. I have 3 children. That takes up a lot of my time when I'm not working. But they're really wonderful. I'm a big reader. I'm a writer. I love, basically, being creative is a lot of what feeds me and nourishes me.
Mm-hmm. Are there any particular modalities you would say you draw upon?
I draw upon, when I was first trained, people didn't even talk about modalities. It was a very different world back then. And I've done a lot of different trainings, some in a lot of depth, and some, weekends here and there. I begin each session, before I meet with somebody, I take time to sort of sit in silence myself, get centered, and ask to be of service. That's generally the prayer I have before going into session. And so I show up, and then I work pretty intuitively from there. So I end up doing often, obviously there's speaking and listening, but there's also parts work. I use guided meditation, hypnotherapy sometimes, movement, body awareness. Sometimes we'll incorporate some traditional healing tools. But it really depends on the person. I would say it doesn't, as it is for all therapists, I think.
Yeah, okay, cool. So you were a chaplain at some point, right?
Yeah, I was a hospice chaplain for Hospice Austin and also for Grilling Hospice before that. I'm not doing that work anymore because like the last hospice job I had was like 24-hour shifts and mostly calls in the middle of the night right after someone had died. And with 3 children and a regular therapy practice, it's not something I can do in this part of my life. And so that's why I sort of moved into doing that contract work with Flatwater and kind of I love hospice work and working with one person at a time, kind of being with them through that end of life and into that transition of death and with their family. I love to do that. But the hospice system itself doesn't work like that. You see tons and tons of patients in the schedule and all of that kind of thing. So, but yeah, it's that work is very close to my heart.
What have you found to be the common experiences of persons who are grieving a loss?
I'd say the most common experience is that it includes every emotion under the sun. Grief can be sadness. We often think of sadness, and it can also be relief. It can be anger. It can be joyousness. It can mean feeling very connected to the person that just passed, and it can mean feeling incredibly lonely. So I think that the commonality is, I often talk about it as grieving as, like waves in an ocean, that oftentimes in the beginning with a major loss, the waves is like tsunami, and it's just like knocking you down, and you might get back up and you're like, okay, I feel a little normal, and then it knocks you down again. And that over time, often those waves kind of even out a little more, but they will still come, and sometimes can come out of nowhere, when the loss hasn't been on your mind for a while. But it's not linear, it's not linear at all. And the loss, there's so many people and things that we can lose, and we don't have always, we can have very complicated relationships with the people we lose or the situations that change. So to me, grief contains all things, and it's part of what makes us human.
Yeah. What sorts of unhelpful beliefs do you think people tend to hold about death? And what about life?
I'd say one of the most unhelpful beliefs that this culture has about death is that death is medical failure. It's like there's this idea, you fight the illness and you fight and fight and fight, but then at some point, the drugs, the surgery, the intervention doesn't work, and then it's like as if you failed when we have to accept that there's nothing more that can be done. And I think seeing death as a failure is quite a setup, because death is life, and I believe that our disconnect from nature in this culture is part of why we have so much trouble with death, because when you live in tune with the seasons and your schedule, what you do with your life is in tune with nature, death is part of life, and you get that at the energetic level, not just the cognitive level that we know. So I think, and also seeing death in this way of, as a failure, as this final, like it's such it's sad, there's something that feels very lacking in that, like it doesn't make room for when something is lost, like this space opens up, and what might be reborn, what might come in. I'm not saying that person, we're talking about a loss of a person that you love, that person's not going to come back to life, but your connection with them, may actually become something different after they're gone. And we don't really have space to talk about that in this culture. And I think it's too bad, because people have all kinds of experiences that don't feel safe to talk about in public.
I never thought about that before, but you're right. I think death is seen as medical failure. And to see death as failure of life, like, that is really quite
the setup.
The setup, yeah.
Yeah.
What about unhelpful? Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's also, at least the dying process, when in hospice, you have some warning, and that's a gift. When you know that it's happening, I've seen just such amazing healing happen for people because of that. Like, having an acceptance and an acknowledgement of their own dying has helped them to, clean up relationships and find forgiveness and really come to a sense of peace. And to me, that is not failure at all. That is leaving a legacy of a good death.
Yeah. It sucks, though, that sometimes we have to wait until we're about to die to do those things,
Absolutely. Yeah, I think if anything, the knowledge of death can teach us to live, can teach us to appreciate, can teach us when we're in a conflict with somebody to, make sure we clean up our own side. Do I feel okay? Do I feel in right relationship? Like, do I feel good about in integrity with my side of this, because that's all we can do. But to be right in our own hearts and to remember, you never know how much longer you have. So how can I live this fully, and we're only here temporarily.
Yeah. What about unhelpful beliefs about life? Do you think that we as a culture hold any of those?
I think there's probably a lot of unhelpful beliefs that we hold as a culture. This need to, this constant, like, keep going, keep growing, keep going, keep growing, this constant more, I think is exhausting. And progress for the sake of progress, whatever that means, again, it's a disconnect from nature in the sense that there's a cycle, where there's seeds under the ground and then they sprout and then they bloom and then, it falls and then it dies and then it comes again, and instead in our culture, we want to just stay on all the time, and we forget about the need for rest and to work with balancing, and that it's okay to have times of high productivity. And it's okay to kind of like come back into the more feminine, receptive energy as well. So, slowing down, I think, is a medicine, myself included, that a lot of us really need, and perhaps has been coming in more these days.
Yeah. During the pandemic, everyone has experienced loss, whether that's loss of family or friends due to COVID, or even just the loss of our ability to socialize as we've been accustomed to. What do you recommend to people to help them cope with grief about these losses?
Well, I'd say, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think grief applies to all kinds of losses, not just death. And so we are grieving all the time. So I'd say the first thing is to acknowledge that it's okay to be grieving those sometimes smaller losses, sometimes ambiguous loss, where you don't know where something is, or is this the end, or is it not? It's basically about change. So acknowledging feelings, allowing oneself to feel those things and to grieve that. And to, for me, it's how can I pull back the lens and have a bigger perspective, and see everything that begins also ends. Like, things are always in change. So this is a loss right now. And is it Is it perhaps like clearing something out and now it's super uncomfortable and this unknown and nothing else has filled it, but we don't know. Something else might come in, and so there's some mix of not sugarcoating. I don't want to just draw a silver lining around everything. I think we really need to acknowledge and feel those losses. I remember for me, the first thing in the pandemic, before everything shut down, they shut down this community wellness hour I was running. That was just this beautiful gathering that included acupuncture and meditation. And it was just a very diverse group that was coming. And I just started crying when I heard that was shut down. It's like, oh, we're not going to be able to gather as a community anymore. And, I think it's good to, even if these are more minor losses, to just give some space to grieve that, give some space to feel that. And also to, be in nature, go outside, see how this happens. This is part of the life that we're born into, and to just remember that things are always changing, even if we can't see that.
Yep. Everything is constantly changing.
Yeah.
Nothing is the same today as it is tomorrow, which I think is actually really relieving.
Yeah.
Because that always means that things can get better.
Absolutely. Right. Just as our, joys are not forever, neither is our suffering. So right. Everything's always in flux. And to me, that helps me to feel like, okay, I'm on an adventure here. I kind of signed up for this game, and let's play it, and let's, we came here to feel all the feelings there are to feel and to have all these experiences. And loss is a part of life, and it sometimes is excruciating. It sometimes brings you to your knees, and it feels like it won't ever feel better. And that's what's so profound and amazing to me, is to hear the stories of people that have gone through just such incredible traumatic loss and find meaning again, find a purpose, help other people. It's quite amazing, the human spirit in that way. And so I draw a lot of inspiration from that.
What do you make of the types of losses of relationships of people who are still living?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've heard of Pauline, I think it's Pauline Boss who coined the term ambiguous loss.
I haven't, no.
I listened to a podcast by her, and I really liked that term, that she called it ambiguous loss. And that's, the losses of relationships, that person's still living, but we can't communicate, we can't connect anymore. And it feels almost like it would be easier if there was a death, because you can't fully grieve, you can't complete that, it's not clean in that way. And that can be very challenging. There's a lot of ambivalence that comes along with that, a lot of conflicted emotions. And I do feel like that's, for me, has been some of the greatest learning in life, is to accept. And I've gotten a lot of this from actually talking and working with women in their 80s and up, to see that there are things in life that don't get cleaned up, that do not get closure, that we don't, I think as therapists, we often love to have that little package that we can tie up with a bow, but there are things that do not get resolved. And that is part of this great opening as well. Like, how can I be with the things in my life that are still unresolved, and the relationships that have not fully healed? Can I have enough compassion for myself in that, as well as the other person and the whole big mess of it all? How can I fall back into that bigger heart? And have, mercy on ourselves.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think life is kind of messy sometimes. And I think that's just the nature of the beast,
Yeah, definitely.
So, curious question. I came up with this question because I'm just extremely curious. In your experience as a chaplain, have there been any reoccurring themes of the types of things people express on their deathbed? And what implications do you think these have for life?
Yeah, I think one thing has to do with forgiveness and relationships. I many times saw people, they might have their whole family around, everyone loves them, and it's all beautiful. And there's that one person, that one child or the sister or somebody that something was left in not a good place with. And that's the person they want to see, like this real need for forgiveness and for healing, reconciliation when possible. When someone knows that their end is near, and being able to clear resentments, even if somebody isn't still living or you can't contact them and bring them in, really wanting to clear that has been a theme, which again points back to, as we live our lives, to be cleaning up our side. We can't do the work for anyone else, but to be cleaning up our side. And, the other thing that I've seen a lot as people are dying is the person who's dying recognizes that a shift has happened, and often is having some other experiences, sometimes seeing people who have passed before them, or just having some other experiences, and they're not able to talk about it with their loved ones. A lot of times the people around someone who's dying, especially if they haven't yet had hospice involved, or even actually when they did have hospice involved, would kind of keep a brave face and keep a smile and say, oh no, you're doing great, and not even talk about it, that it's somehow taboo to talk about death. And then this person who's going through this major life transition that no one around them has ever gone through before, that they've been taught to fear their whole life, is now completely alone in that, amongst their loved ones. And so I think it's important that we talk about death openly, and that we, even if you don't know what to say, when someone's grieving or when that's happening, just to express care, just to let conversations about death be something that we can do, I think is really important, because it can leave people feeling quite alone at the end if we don't.
Is there any, because you mentioned like a switch happens, or a person recognizes a switch. Can you speak a little more to that? I'm curious about what that looks like when it happens,
Yeah, well, they might notice that somehow they're not, like, sometimes people don't really even explain very clearly what's going on, but they might notice, like, I'm not getting all these medications I used to get, or, that doctor's not coming anymore. And no one's actually told this person that, like, sort of straight out, that you're dying now. Like, we don't know how long that'll be, but that's the process that you're in. And sometimes people really need to have that direct conversation. And a lot of times that's someone from hospice, not always, sometimes it's someone in the family. But not everybody can have that conversation. That's a very, very difficult conversation for many people to have. But I wouldn't say there's like one moment of shift. I'm just thinking of situations where someone is, in their sick bed, basically, and they're just noticing the behavior of people around them, but no one's actually talked to them directly. Or they feel in their own body, I don't know, because I myself haven't gone through this transition, but I think that, you can kind of see, as someone starts leaving here, their presence, they're going more and more inwards, and they seem like they're elsewhere. So you can kind of watch that happening. And I think it happens in kind of phases, and then plateaus, and will kind of happen again. But I think generally when it comes to regrets, what I've seen most has had to do with relationships, and also, taking risks. I think people at the end, they are often doing a lot of accounting, for their lives, and, what has meant a lot, and what have been the highlights, and where would they have done something different. And a lot of people, wish they took some risks that they didn't, and it's easier to see that in hindsight.
Yeah. What role does fear play in death?
I think it's innate for us to have some fear of death. I mean, this is our survival mechanism kicking in, right? So the body is going to fight to live, and that's good, and having some sense in your being that wants to live is good. So there's some level of fear of death that protects us, but that's more of the saber-toothed tiger coming.
Yeah.
But the fear of death, I see death as an incredibly wise and powerful teacher, like a elder teacher, ally, who actually wipes things clean in some ways. Like, because there's an ending, something new can begin. So death is a teacher of compassion and forgiveness and rebirth. And so the fear of death, if you imagine that there's this very wise, very powerful teacher, feeling some trepidation and intimidation around that is, some of that is humbling and important. But it also means that we don't get to know death very well. And I felt like my years in doing hospice work, for me, was really about befriending death. Like I had some experiences, especially in the beginning, that terrified me, that really, really humbled me, but the going back in again, and being with it and being willing to learn, and letting my patients teach me, and letting death teach, I think that getting to know death a little bit more intimately can really give us a lot of meaning in life. I can't say, doing that kind of work, you just can't pretend, like it's just very real. So the fear of death, I think it's with us, it's with us in our human bodies. But I think in this culture, because we've made it like a failure, because we've made it, because we don't talk about it, because we only take a day off to go to a funeral and then we get back to work. Of course it seems scary, because it's like one day you matter and then you're gone. And when we look at it that way, it's very sad. So I think it's getting to know death in a different way, and like, what are the gifts that come from that? What connection happens through that process? There's really a lot there.
What have you personally learned from death and being around it, and your experiences?
Gosh, let's see.
I know that's a big question.
You mean like being around when someone's just died?
Yeah, being around when someone's just died, and talking about death frequently, how do you think that has, how do you think you've learned, what do you think you've learned from it? And maybe even how has it changed you?
A big part of what I've learned has been about appreciation. It's been about appreciating the very little things of being able to drink a glass of water and having air to breathe and tasting a blueberry, that sort of thing. I think it has taught me both to make the most out of life, and also to have a lot of compassion, that we're really, to take some of the pressure off, while also knowing that really love is the most important thing we have going on here. And I feel all I can say is grateful and humbled by it. I mean, I feel like that relationship, I remember actually the very last hospice visit I did, and I knew it was going to be the last, I think, because I had given notice. And just really like drinking it in. It was a man who was 105, I think, who had died, and
Wow.
And all of his, his children, all kinds of family members were around, and we were just sitting, and they were, he was dead and in the bed, and the family member was around, and we were just, talking about, they were telling me about him and his life, and people were laughing, and, they opened a window and just sharing these stories, crying, laughing, and just feeling so much beauty, like so much beauty for this long life, and seeing how this person and who he was carried down into these people who had loved him. It just is a connection to this whole big mystery of life that is, I don't know anything else that has quite that power.
Yeah. What do you think about life and meaning? Do you believe meaning is inherent or created or both?
I don't know how to answer that, I guess. I feel like we are little ants on an anthill, trying to understand the universe. Like, we're just these little people on this planet. And yeah, we have some technologies that's told us some things about maybe what's out there in the physical world, but I hold all beliefs lightly, knowing that there's more that we can't know and don't know than that we can, and so meaning, I think, is part of what we need as human beings. It's so, meaning keeps us going, it's so important. So in that way, I guess you could say we create meaning. And is there inherent, like, larger meaning? Is there I do, I guess, personally have, like, there are natural laws, it seems. But I can only see from these eyes in this little body. So I can't see the whole picture. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. That's the best I got.
Okay. Let's talk about grief related to change. In what ways do or don't you think change is akin to loss? And why do you think we grieve change so much?
I think I don't know if I can think of a change that doesn't involve some loss. So even the things we think of as celebratory experiences, like I often work with, women becoming mothers or, getting married or something like that. There is loss in that, there is loss in the independence, the individuality, in those new steps that we think of. These are the good things, and here's these bad changes, right? So all change involves some loss and something new, and oftentimes quite a bit of transition in there that's neither one nor the other. And I think your question about, can you repeat that, about why don't we like it?
Why do we grieve it so much? Why do we grieve change?
I mean, I think we're most of us are creatures of habit. We feel safe, we feel comfortable. We naturally kind of want to stay in our comfort zones, and all change is going to push us out of there. And that is the nature of life. And we know that we need that. And yet, anxiety and excitement, those are the same sensation in the body, just with a different positive or negative take on it, right? And so it's natural to feel anticipation, to feel like, I don't know about this change. It's the unknown. To me, it's about how we are with the unknown. And I don't know if that's something we could even try to take away. That change is about, I'm letting something go and something else is being born, and I don't know what that's going to be like. So we often are like, well, I'd rather stay where I am and what I know than have change occur. And I think sometimes we are trying to have a change happen and it won't, because it's not time yet. And other times we don't want change at all and it happens to us in an instant. And this is our work, is how to trust, how to breathe, how to trust, how to be with right timing of things. This is what happens. This is the life we live in.
There's in my work, over time, I've noticed that people generally struggle with at least one of four fears. And those fears are fear of the unknown, fear of change, fear of failure, and fear of rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like death is kind of a combination of all those things in some ways.
I think death, like grief, it's everything, right? Because you take a whole life, and death means the end of all of it. There's a finality. Even with whatever spiritual beliefs that you hold, there is some level of finality in the physical being. So that's a big one. So it brings in all the fears. It brings in all of the everything about life. It's all of it.
What, and you don't have to answer this question, what do you believe happens after death?
I don't hold any belief about what happens after death in any strong way. I don't believe that it's something that I can say with 100% or even 90%, any confidence.
Well,
this is what it is, right? Nobody can. Well, sometimes people try.
They like to think they can.
They like to think they can. But yeah, so I have to preface it with that. What I have experienced in being in the room with somebody who has just died, or in being with people who have experienced the loss of someone very close to them, who continue to experience that connection with people who have passed already, is the sense of something that continues, whether you call that the spirit, whether you call that the love, the connection that you have, whether you work with the ancestors. I don't have a linear way of thinking about those things. All I know is that I think in this culture, we tend to look at what we can see and touch and taste and smell, the physical senses. It's a materialist point of view. And I believe that there's more to this experience than what we can know from our senses. And so I feel a connection with my ancestors. I feel that feels real in the way that you feel a connection with a friend that you may not see much at all, but that connection's there, and sometimes you can call them,
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I have no idea what happens. All I know is that I've heard enough near-death experiences, been in the room with somebody who has just died and felt something, and also listened to people's stories to keep an open mind about it. Yeah.
From those experiences that you just described, near-death experiences and the like, is there any consistent thing that people report?
I'm not a scholar of near-death experiences, though I do love reading memoirs, and I've definitely met quite a few people in my life who have told me these stories. So I feel like someone else could answer that with more referencing. But it is a common experience to, some sort of light, some sort of, oftentimes seeing people who they were close to before that have already died, or some kind of guide. I've heard many stories, like I'm remembering a guy who was telling me, sort of like having a choice point, being kind of offered this choice and feeling. I've seen people who've had near-death experiences kind of feel like there's some different purpose they either already feel or feel they should have, when they come back. Those seem to be some of the commonalities that I've, from my, less experience, but from what I've seen, that's what I've noticed.
Interesting. Cool. In your experience as a chaplain, what do you think the general public needs to know the most about death? Or what sorts of conversations should we be having? Like
Yeah.
what should we be doing with death?
Yeah. I think having the conversations, not being afraid to ask questions, and not thinking that if you don't talk about it, then somehow you're protecting this person, because likely they already know, and just they're really alone in that. So talking about what somebody's wishes are, for after they're gone, and whatever they may want to hand down, or if there's something really meaningful to them that they would like to be honored through or by, having those kinds of conversations. I definitely recommend getting, if it's a, not a sudden situation, but and it's so hard right now. But if someone is in a disease process where you do see that end coming, getting hospice involved sooner rather than later is such a gift. People are afraid to call hospice because they feel like that means they're giving up. But the truth is, hospice is the best our healthcare system has to offer. You have nurses and social workers and chaplains coming to your house, bringing you things you need. We sometimes would, help bring in the long lost brother or whatever to come and talk to the person. I mean, there's just a lot of support there. And so, really having the conversations, just ask, even if it feels awkward and weird and you don't know the right words, just saying that, I don't know how to talk about this, but I wonder how you're feeling about that. How are you feeling about dying?
Yeah. I decided years ago that I want a Viking funeral.
I love it.
Now, I also understand that you facilitate women's groups and personal ceremony. Can you tell us more about those services you offer?
Sure. I may have mentioned in the beginning. So on Tuesday evenings, I run what I call Release and Empower. And it's a women's group that is not a therapy group, but it's a more what I would call like a ceremony or a mini retreat. So we do writing, movement and vocalization, and guided meditation, and then we come back together for just some brief sharing. So it's really about carving out some space. It's mostly therapists themselves. So I mostly work with women who are helping professionals, sometimes, oftentimes moms, not always. Basically, what we call emotional caregivers, the women who are kind of keep holding the world together by holding space and providing that kind of care. And so these are the women that come, and often they're burnout or their own anxiety and grief, going through life transitions. Oftentimes, women who really have been kind of hard on themselves, really compassionate with other people, and want to build that self-compassion. Oftentimes women working on boundaries and being able to say no. So, but the way that we work with it is not interpersonal processing. It's really about having a container to do personal work. So doing heart-centered writing practice and releasing, stress, anxiety, depression, whatever's going on through the body, through movement, through opening the voice, having a rest time, and then being able to share, but not in with no crosstalks. We're not giving advice. We're not giving opinions. This is really about witnessing each other. So that group is really about honoring each woman's own internal guidance and wisdom, and trusting her in her strength, and having a supportive container for that. And then the ceremonial work I do as an interfaith minister varies a lot. I officiate weddings and funerals and coming of age ceremonies, and sometimes birthing rituals. It kind of depends. Sometimes that sort of work is worked into my individual counseling sessions. If somebody is going through some kind of major transition, we might do a little ritual work as well. But yeah, I mean, I'd say, part of, I may have mentioned this earlier about the therapist role feeling a little bit tight of a box for me. And I think I identify just as much sort of as a ceremonialist. And so being able to weave those two things together has been just really nourishing, really, really wonderful.
Yeah, it's very cool. What are some common misconceptions about death that you've come across?
Misconceptions about death. I think, the idea that I think that some level of pain in the transition, some level of suffering, that the body system shutting down is a process, and I don't know if anyone experiences that comfortably, even with a lot of medication. Sometimes we medicate people so far that they aren't really conscious of what's going on. So I guess one misconception may be that you don't have choices there. Like you do have choices about how much of a medication, how much morphine or if you want to take all these other pills that come along with it, or, you do have choices about that. And there are other alternatives, for instance, acupuncture can help with pain relief, or so just, and the idea that it's safer to die in a hospital, or that's where you have to die. You can die at home, you can die at home with people you love nearby. But you have to be willing to sign that DNR and say, no, don't resuscitate me, And so that's a big choice to make. That's a big shift for someone when they make that choice. But just to know, I think in all things, like to me, it reminds me a lot of birth, the process around birth and what goes on around that, birth and death being so interconnected in that way that this is actually a natural process, that this is, animals do this all the time and they find where they need to be. And we've made, our lives are so complex, the healthcare system is so complicated. And so we forget that we have choices around these things that we can, so that's why it's important to have those conversations, just the same as having those conversations before having a birthing experience.
Yeah. Am I making it up, or is there such thing as a death doula?
There is. Yeah.
That's
absolutely.
So cool.
Yeah. And I think, I love that term. And I think part of what they do is similar to what a hospice chaplain does. And then the other part is actually more similar to what the caregiver does, in the sense of like just really being by the bedside and being with someone in that whole process, as they, the same as like a midwife with a laboring mother, having someone to doula that process is just a beautiful, beautiful thing. And everybody's different. I have seen situations where there is a loved one by the side of the person who's dying, like every moment, barely going to the bathroom. And then this one day they have to go down to the kitchen. There's this errand, and that's when they die. And it's like, that's when they can finally let go, when someone here isn't, keeping them tied. So I think it'll happen in its own timing.
And alternatively, I've seen it happen where the person might wait until somebody gets there.
Yes.
To die too.
Exactly.
Which I think is fascinating.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to how we're all different also, different in life. Of course, we're going to be different in death. Some of us will want to be alone. Some of us will want that one person. It's amazing how those things happen. And I think another misconception, sometimes people have had just a really horrible experience with someone in their life dying, and it was handled not well at all. And so then it creates this like, oh no, like all death experiences are going to be like that. And there really is quite a range, for how that goes. And then there are certain things, in the process where someone is just gradually, sometimes through abrupt changes, but gradually over time, kind of going, all the systems are shutting down and they're going more inwards and become more unreachable. and to know, you know, sometimes people get worried because they say my person's hallucinating, and they get really worried. And, you know, and again, are they hallucinating? Are they making contact with, you know, people who have passed before them? You can use it from a different frame and explain it in a different way. But to not fear those things, like to see if we can make space for them and honor that, and not be in this belittling, like, oh yeah, dad's in the room. Yeah. Like, well, maybe she can see something you can't, you know, and who's to say what's real here? You know,
and also, like, is there a way to help facilitate that too? I'm just, you know, curious.
To facilitate that happening?
Well, if somebody's, you know, having hallucinations or making contact, is there a way somebody could assist somebody in, like, in that contact that they're making? Like, you know what I mean? Like,
well, I think you could, just the same as you would with anything else, right? Like, suppose that you're having a therapy session with someone and someone else is in the room, you know, but you're not actually able to hear that. You know, you could ask them, well, what are they telling you? Do they seem happy? You know, what's the feeling you get? Or, you know, and there's a difference between someone feeling, sometimes people will seem very agitated by it, you know, and so having that person that's in the living world say, to normalize that experience, or to say, oh, wow, you know, she came to visit you. And that can be settling. But a lot of times when people are in that place, they're not fully here. So,
right.
You know, but processing it afterwards, because people will kind of come in and out a little bit over time. You know, you'll have those moments of lucidity, and but a lot of that process is nonverbal. You know, so much of what goes on at the end there's a lot less conversation, you know, but your presence, though, is really important. I mean, that's something that always struck me. The first time I did hospice work, I would work with a family over time as the person, you know, go visit weekly or however often until they died, and then kind of do some bereavement work. But the second time, it was mostly these shifts, you know, where I would just like get there half an hour after the person had died and they're still in the house, and they want, you know, the chaplain to come do a blessing and be with the family. And I lost my train of thought of.
Well, you were just talking about how, like, being alone, being with somebody after somebody has passed away.
Oh, right. So yes, thank you. The feeling in the room right after someone has died, like, was different is different with different people, but it's almost tangible. Like, there's some presence, there's something that feels differently in the room. So yeah, I don't have any cognitive understanding of or how you explain it from a lot of different lenses, you know, but there really is deep presence, you know, and you can feel that as someone is in the process of dying as well. So sometimes people will be like, well, why should I bother going and being with them? They aren't talking anymore and they can't understand me, you know, and it's your presence, you know, they can feel that love, you know, you can offer that just through holding their hand and just sitting for an hour or so, you know, or whatever it is. So to not feel like you have to be having conversation in order to be supporting someone, I think that's important.
Got it. I don't know if you're familiar with it, and they're probably not doing it now, but Seton has a program called No One Dies Alone, where they have a bunch of volunteers on call.
Yeah.
And when anybody, you know, is about to pass away, they call the volunteers so they can go and be with that person as they pass. I think that's such a cool program.
I do too. And I'd be curious about, like you said, because there are some people who will wait till they're alone. So I'd be curious about that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's been really fun talking about just fascinating stuff. I'm so fascinated with it.
Me too. And I think I want to add too that, you know, because it is such a, you know, it's kind of a heavy subject, that to me, a lot of the teaching is about celebrating life, is about, really celebrating little things all the time, finding the mystery in a flower, that sort of thing. I mean, I think that to me is the comfort of knowing that this is a temporary situation that we're in here,
Yeah. Okay. Well, switching gears back to more about you as a practitioner, what kind of experience do you have working with particularly vulnerable clients, such as those who are transgender, undocumented, or BIPOC, to name a few examples?
Yeah, so my foundation was in nonprofit work and social work. So when I started out, I've worked at a lot of nonprofits in town. I started out at what's now the Safe Alliance. It's called some other things before. I worked at LifeWorks for a long time, the Griffin School, American Youth Works. When I was in Santa Fe at the Santa Fe Rape Crisis Center, worked in AmeriCorps. So I've worked in a lot of different environments that drew in a very diverse crowd from all races, cultures, sexuality, ages, income, education, all kinds of people, and loved doing that work. It's really, really important. And that's why, what I was saying about that community wellness hour was a free gathering that we hosted every week, and about 25 to 30 people would come and, receive acupuncture. And then we do a guided meditation and just a really brief sharing. And it was such a, really from, people off the street to, elders to young people and of all different races and cultures, and to be able to sit together in silence. So beautiful. I hope that we will get to do that again someday. So,
I know.
Yeah. So I feel like I've, there's certainly some populations I've worked, I have not worked that much with the transgender population. And when I talk to a potential client, if I don't feel a yes and like this is meant to be, this resonance, I will do my best to think of, to find them someone that I think is really going to be a good match. And I really want people to be connected with therapists that they feel get them, and I think that's important.
That's the role of this podcast.
I love it. I love how you say in the beginning that you ask these questions, because people can get so discouraged. I understand that, you don't want to tell your whole story, this very vulnerable story, to 4 different people. And, so people don't shop around, and then you start working with someone and it's not quite right, but you don't want to start over. So it's so important. The therapy is the presence of that therapist, so it's totally different. Even if 2 people have the exact same training and background and certifications, it's going to feel completely different. So yeah, I think it's great that you're doing this and giving people an inside view of who the therapists are.
Yeah, me too. It's been really fun so far. What would a new client expect from an initial session with you? And what about on an ongoing basis? Is there any sort of structure to your sessions, or how do you go about your sessions?
The only real structure, and there are a few I don't do this with, but I usually start off with a period of silence. So I have a little meditation bell. I might, depending on the person, kind of guide them to, we're just going to have a moment to get grounded in the body, center in yourself, kind of feel yourself in your space, and then, see what naturally arises in your heart that wants to be witnessed or be worked with today. And then we'll just sit in that silence, and I'll tell the person, they can, when they feel ready, they can start. And some people like to sit for a few minutes. Some people, it's just a moment, but really have a sense where we're both tuning in together and kind of letting go of what came before so that we can show up. So that's generally how I'll start sessions. And mostly it's so variable depending on, who the person is. But a lot of times, sometimes people there are things that need to be talked about, and that will be a good deal of it. But sometimes, a lot of times, it's some beginning amount of time where someone's telling the story and what's going on and where they're what they're working with, and then we might move into more somatic work with that. So locating that in the body. Sometimes that might lead to doing some movement. Sometimes it might be more parts work and some visualization. So I'd say then we might do kind of more process work with that. And then, towards the end, come out into processing, like what are the takeaways? How do you integrate that in your life? But I wouldn't say that that's like, I don't have this is what I do every time with every person. Yeah. But everybody's that's, oftentimes what some level of that might be what happens. So yeah.
Cool. How would you say your clients would describe or experience you?
Let's see. Trying to think of words that that you wouldn't say about any therapist. I think people experience me as compassionate and present. I think people experience me as deeply supportive of them finding their own answers, like of their strength. And, I had a friend once who, maybe in a birthday message or something, said something about a gentle intensity. And I'd say that there's a gentleness that I offer and a certain intensity in the sense that I will ask someone about their dying process. You know what I mean? Like there's so, but I think generally my clients experience me as with them, mm-hmm. with them, present with them, and compassionate and generally supportive of their boundaries and of their really seeing that they are doing the work as opposed to me thinking that I'm doing it. A lot of the feedback I will get from my clients is that they are feeling stronger. They're feeling mm-hmm. stronger in themselves. They're feeling like they're taking better care of themselves. I had a client somewhat recently say something about, I've been in therapy before and I always felt like I really needed to be, I needed the therapist in this way. And I'm learning that I can do things for myself. That I'm learning that I'm taking better care of myself now. And so, I feel like I'm with them, but I'm also not, I also have the boundaries, I guess, of, sitting with someone and also trusting that you have what you need and you can do this.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. How do you define holding space for someone?
I love the term holding space. I wish it was more widely used, because it's one of these things that doesn't get acknowledged, and it's so important, and it's invisible and yet essential. So I see holding space, it's like the energetic container for what's going on. You need the container because that's what creates the safety. Right. That's where there's protection around it. And so then you can go into the process. And I think, was your question, how do you do that?
Or how do you define holding space?
How do you define it? Yeah. I use those words a lot, but mm-hmm. I define it as being present, being present in the self and tuned in to the environment. Like if it's a group and holding space for a group versus holding space for an individual, like however many people are there, that it's almost like being present and imagining there's this sort of container, this protection, this kind of veil around the person or the group or whatever it is. And that, so that it creates that sense of safety that a process can be done in here. And you need to have somebody when in these situations, like there's beautiful work that can happen, but having someone who's holding space, it's really around witnessing and being tuned into all kinds of things, just tuned into what's happening.
Yeah, I think it's such a big part of the work that we do.
Yeah. And I wish that was talked about more, because there's so much emphasis on learning new techniques of things to say or things to do. And when it comes down to it, it's really about the presence with another person and the holding of space, which is the non-interfering. It's really the witnessing and being there with you as you go through this. And there's something that happens. There's something beautiful that happens just in being seen. And I think we need more space holders and to value that aspect of life, because it creates the safety that we need for healing.
Holding space is so important in the people that I work with. I work with mostly the trans and non-binary community, and
glad to know it.
Traditionally, trans and non-binary folks have a hard time being seen. So if I can create that environment where somebody feels seen, sometimes even for the first time, it's incredibly healing, and it makes such a huge, huge difference.
Absolutely. I think it gives people permission, when you've had that and you feel that way, it gives people permission, like, hey, I'm allowed to be me, like there's room in this world for me too. And we need that permission from ourselves before we can accept it from anyone else.
Yeah. Okay. Are you a therapist who will laugh or cry with their clients?
I definitely I definitely laugh with my clients. Do I cry with them? I have mixed feelings. There have been very few times that I have cried in session. And I think really only very early on. And I once in my college years had the experience of my therapist crying, and I did not like it at all. I really didn't like it. And I think that affected me in that way as well, because it felt like it was taking something from me. It felt like, was she crying for me, or was she crying for something in her own experience? And then I started feeling like I had to caregive, and I will feel, I'm an empath, I will feel the depth of that sadness with my client for sure, absolutely. And I will feel that in my heart. And sometimes there are situations, where tears might come to my eyes. But it's really important to me to, like you said, about the holding space, to let this be about them, let this be their space. And my job is to hold compassion for that, to be holding compassion for that. But yeah, laughing for sure.
Okay. What is the best advice you've ever received from a supervisor?
It's been a while. I was supervised in the early 2000s. The best advice I've received from a supervisor was to trust myself. Anything. I'd say to trust myself. I think that especially when you're I work with more than half of my clients are therapists themselves, and some of them are actually quite experienced, and some of them are newer therapists. And I think that can be the hardest thing starting out, is like, I've learned all this stuff, and how do I do it? And, to trust your own intuition. In the end, you're just a person, two people here together, and that I'm going to, open up and trust to the guidance that comes in, and just know that you are enough, like you showing up in yourself, having integrated your own life experiences and training and whatever's come before, that is enough. You are enough.
That's good advice. I kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm sure there's a variety of other things you could speak to. What have you personally learned about yourself and or the world through your practice?
I have learned so much. I mean, I think I have it on my website, even something about, when I talk about my training or whatever, to say something like, I've also learned from every single person I've ever worked with. I mean, it is such a gift. What have I learned about did you say about myself and about
the world?
About the world. I'd say if I step back and look at the past 20 something years, like what have I learned about? I've learned that we can have such diverse experiences, such different stories, and yet human emotion is universal. We experience, there's a range of like flavors of emotion, and that you don't have to have the same experience as someone to be able to touch that in yourself. And that it's amazing what people live through. It's just amazing what people live through. And it's amazing to see what they make of that, and how they grow and how they then go, be of service to other people. And what I've learned about myself, I'd say, is I'm a human also, me too. And that's okay. That I think when I was young, it was particularly hard because I was so young, and I'm seeing, I was working with parents when I was 25 and, didn't have a boyfriend or something, it was like, I thought I needed to have had those experiences or to know certain things. And I couldn't get on the pedestal, and I don't like knock those pedestals down. Like those pedestals are why we have these falls from grace and why we're like, oh my gosh, this person that we thought was so amazing. And now we find out they had this shadow side and all this, it's like, we're all people, so what I've learned about myself is that I'm allowed to have my own shadow, and I need to be real with that and do my own work. And that is the best thing I can offer my clients. The best thing, more than any training or education or experience in terms of clinical work that I can offer my clients, is my ability to be with my own stuff, and my commitment to my own healing is essential for doing this work.
There's a saying that something you said reminded me of. It goes, one does not have to know how to milk a cow to know what milk is.
Interesting.
Which is true. It's actually one of my favorite sayings. Yeah. What do you do to take care of yourself other than 10-mile walks?
Well, that is one aspect. I mean, every morning I take time to move my body, for sure. And that looks different each morning, but it pretty much always involves, I'd say pretty religiously, a walk outside, like a movement that includes being outside. I have a morning practice that varies over time. Right now, it looks like some drumming, some meditation, maybe pulling some cards, some prayer. Those things are, I cook myself a healthy breakfast. Like those are things that are kind of foundational for me, eating well and making space like that. And then, in addition to that, things like, for instance, I told you I have 3 kids. My husband and I switch off every other Saturday, like taking a day off by ourselves kind of thing, making sure that I have time on my own to replenish, connecting with friends, with my own support system, being able to, participate in community, making music in community, doing, like I said, creativity. That's for me, a lot of what is healing for me is being able to sing, to dance, to write, to move, that sort of thing. But I'd say nature for me is where I resource from, hiking and being in quiet, natural areas.
Got it. I'm the same way. My dog, Batty, and I, we go for about a 2-mile walk every morning. I have like a green belt area behind my house, and it's just a lovely, lovely way to start the day.
Nice.
Here's kind of a difficult question, or maybe not. How would you define happiness?
Yeah, that is a difficult question for me. I think because happiness, I feel like U.S. culture is this sort of like slave to happiness, and we need to be happy. Like, what does it mean?
Mm-hmm.
What is happiness? It feels great to feel happy. It's a wonderful feeling, and I think it's fleeting like all others. And I think I'm more interested in joy. I'm more interested in celebration and awe, being in awe of the mystery, being in love with this mystery of life. Happiness, I don't know how I would define happiness. I just think it's just the word has been used in this certain way, but I would say it's a lovely feeling. It's fun to feel happy. It feels like everything's working out and feels good, and it comes and goes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I usually tell my clients, I think it's fairly reasonable, like, expect to be happy maybe 25% of the time, sad maybe 25% of the time. And generally, I feel like our natural state is just neutral, like content,
I think neutrality is undervalued.
I agree. I totally agree.
I've learned a lot in recent years, especially about the value of neutrality, that actually, instead of trying to make everything better in this like la way, to actually feel neutrality towards something is liberating. It's being able to say, okay, like that happened, and now what's next? I think that's, it's something we don't talk much about at all.
Yeah. And people, I find, just their expectation, the thing that they strive for, the thing that they believe everybody else has, but they don't, is happiness.
Thank Instagram and Facebook. And
I know.
I mean, I think it must be a super common experience for therapists, to just like hear all the time, well, but everybody is doing this. And it's just like, and like, yes, those things happen. And what is all that's not being shown?
Right.
What are the pictures? Who's taking a picture when someone's sobbing? Nobody's taking a picture. So, so we think we have such this biased view, and then you look at the other parts of the media that we watch, shows and things like that, and happy endings and everything. Like, it's just not that neat. And I think that's great to give people. It's almost like if we shift like what the aim is, then everything becomes just a little easier. If I'm not, then I don't feel like I'm failing if I'm not happy all the time. Like, I feel bored. Like, can I be with the feeling of bored? And then what will happen? Like, I don't know, but it's just, how can I be so fully in this human experience that I can be with it as it comes, instead of trying to get on to, hang on to one or the other, because it just doesn't work. On a practical level, it just doesn't work.
Okay, well, a little bit of a vulnerable question here. What is the most embarrassing moment you have had as a clinician?
I'm trying to think of most embarrassing. I can think of a very early embarrassing moment. It was I I had just started at LifeWorks as a therapist. I had an LMSW at the time, but it was, I was going to start getting those clinical hours. And it was my first day at work, and I was hired there as a bilingual counselor. So about half my work was going to be in Spanish. But I had, it was my first day of work, so I wasn't supposed to see any clients. I was supposed to just be trained for a couple of days or learn their systems. But somebody walked in and they spoke Spanish, and nobody else in the office spoke Spanish. So they were like, you need to talk to them because they just walked in. So I'm sitting there with a pregnant teenage girl speaking in Spanish, and I am not a native speaker. And I'm talking to her, and I'm so nervous. This is my first counseling session. And as I'm talking, I say something about her being 15, and I say 15. And her friend was with her, and they just cracked up, and they thought that was so funny because it's like saying, are you 10-5 instead of 15, and I was like, oh my gosh, they know that I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know how to speak Spanish, I don't know how to counsel anyone. So I'm sure I turned beat red, but we laughed about it, and, we moved through it. And so that was my first day one, first client.
That's awesome. It's cool that you speak Spanish.
Not as well anymore. Like I would not, it's been a long time since I've gotten to use it on a regular basis. So it's super rusty.
Sabe poquito español, pero mi español es muy mal.
Oh, está bien.
Well, thank you for sharing that embarrassing moment. I appreciate it. Another kind of vulnerable question here. Are you in therapy, or have you ever been in therapy yourself?
I've definitely seen therapists. I've definitely been in therapy myself. I think in some programs, I think it is required. I don't know. I think it should be required. I mean, why enter a profession if you haven't experienced it yourself? Right. At this point, there is a counselor. She's actually has kind of a different background also, a counselor / ceremonialist, older woman that I will call now and again when I need support. So I'm not currently in weekly therapy, but it's definitely, in my experience, like I was saying, it's about the person, so when I think there's times in life when it's been helpful to me to have that as a weekly support. And there's, for I'd say the last maybe decade or so, it's been more of on an as needed basis. Mm-hmm. But it's something that I know, as I work with different clients and see how they use therapy, I really recognize its usefulness in different ways, that sometimes it's like we're going through something really hard and you need mm-hmm. somebody by your side. And sometimes it's like, hey, this person knows me and like I got stuck here and need help moving that through. And I think it's part of why I love working with other therapists is because I think it's so important that we give that to ourselves too, and that we allow ourselves to receive and be vulnerable, and have space for our own work. But I'd say, some of my own personal work is not done so much with a therapist, is done, like I said, in community or in group or mm-hmm. in other forms of, I might see other healers, other modalities.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, is there anything else you think would be good for a potential client or other therapists to know about you?
I think we've pretty much covered it. I mean, I work, I think I've really talked about kind of who ends up finding me and how we work mm-hmm. together. And I just want to encourage people that if it feels resonant to know that you really can have a free inquiry call and just, check things out and see how it feels and find the person that feels right for you, that really makes a difference, and your trust is sacred, so I really feel, when a client is thanking me, I so genuinely feel, that this is it's really an honor to be in that space with you. And I feel so lucky to love what I do, and I love I love working with other therapists and with people who are doing the work of holding space for other people. And I think because of my background in working in nonprofits for that first sort of like decade, I know the toll it can take, and so I really see myself now as kind of being kind of like the backup support. Like if, there's people on the front lines and they're seeing 40 clients a week or, just like super busy and all this stuff going on, like to really have a place they can come back and be a refuge. And like, this is a space just for me. And I think that's sort of what I hold for people.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on the show, Julia. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Noah.
The next question. The next question. The next question. The next question.
Thank you for listening to NextQuest podcast. I learned something new today, and I hope you did too. Next week's featured therapist and specialty are to be determined at this point due to a cancellation. However, I assure you it'll be fun. NextQuest podcast is sponsored by Jan Dimmitt Resources. Save yourself the time and stress of credentialing and let the experts at Jan Dimmitt Resources do what they do best. For over 20 years, Jan Dimmitt Resources has provided administrative support and credentialing services to mental health professionals in Texas and beyond. Visit their website at jandimmitt.com. That is JANDIMMITT.com, or call 512-731-5725 for more information on all the ways they can make running your practice easier for you. NextQuest podcasts rely solely on donations to keep this project going. Please consider becoming a patron on my Patreon page at www.patreon, that's patreon.com/NextQuestPodcast, or you can make a one-time donation on my website at www.nextquestcounseling.com/aboutnextquestpodcast. You can also support the podcast by liking our Facebook page. Until next question, this is Noah Garcia signing off.